FCLE review. Today we're going to be looking at landmark legislation and some executive actions. The FCLE, if you don't know already, has 4 parts. There's Competency 1, which is understanding of the basic principles and practices of American democracy and how they are applied in our Republican form of government. Competency 2, understanding of the United States Constitution and its application. 3, knowledge of the founding documents and how they have shaped the nature and function of our institutions of self-government. And 4, understanding of landmark Supreme Court cases, landmark legislation, and landmark executive actions and their impact on law and society. Today we're mostly going to be looking at landmark legislation and executive actions. The first of the review sessions, we did the Supreme Court cases. I think that's probably the hardest part of the test. There's 26 Supreme Court cases that you're supposed to know, and it's a wide range of ones that I think most people just don't know. I mean, there's some big ones that most people have heard of, like Roe v. Wade, but there's all sorts of other ones like Texas v. Johnson and Hazelwood v. Kohlmeyer that most people don't know. But so if you are interested, you can go back and you can watch the video on that Supreme Court cases. So I think that's the hardest part of the test as well. Besides the fact that it's 26 Supreme Court cases, it's hard to fake your way through that. Like with the, say, founding documents of the Constitution, sometimes you can use like context clues and kind of figure it out. But if I ask you a question about Hazelwood v. Kohlmeyer, the name gives you absolutely nothing. Like there's no way to fake your way through that. Okay, but today, again, we're going to be looking at landmark legislation and executive actions. The test is 80 questions. You need a 60%, 48 questions correct to pass. And it is multiple choice, so you can use test-taking strategies on a lot of it, even if it doesn't work 100% on all of them. Even on the Supreme Court cases, if they ask you about a case you've never heard of, you have nothing, you don't know anything, but if you look at the options, maybe there'll be, a case that says, which one of the following is a First Amendment case? And you see Roe v. Wade, and if you know what Roe v. Wade is, that's not a First Amendment case. So you can still use test-taking strategies, at least to eliminate one. Okay, so now, legislation. A few of the ones that they say you need to know. Compromise of 1850. 1850, which is before the Civil War. Civil War, 1860s. This is 5 laws. You don't need to know like crazy details about these things, but what you should know is that this is before the Civil War and helps lead into the Civil War because it does a few things. It has the Fugitive Slave Act, which required that if a person who was enslaved escaped to a free state, the people in the free state had to capture them and send them back to slavery. This was a instigating factor in the Civil War because it made people in the North or in free states feel complicit in slavery. It was one thing to say, well, we're a free state, that's a slave state, but now if a person escapes into a free state and I'm in a free state, do I have to participate in slavery by sending them back? And so the Northern abolitionists really hated this law. I mean, they were already against slavery, but now they felt like they were being legally forced to participate in slavery. So one of the big issues with the Compromise of 1850 is the Fugitive Slave Act. It did do some other things that ended the slave trade in Washington, D.C. Side note, they're not going to ask you this detail, but it did not outlaw slavery in D.C., it just ended the slave trade in D.C. It did admit California as a free state. The reason California came in as a free state is because California as a territory had a constitution that was making it a free territory, so it was automatically a free state. On the other hand, Utah and New Mexico were being added as territories, but they didn't have constitutions yet, so this allowed the people there to kind of figure out what they wanted to do. So, Compromise of 1850, though, it did help lead to the Civil War, especially because of the Fugitive Slave Act. Kansas-Nebraska Act. Kansas-Nebraska Act. also helped lead to the Civil War. It repealed the Missouri Compromise. You might remember from like middle school or maybe high school, the Missouri Compromise said that new territories and states north of the Mason-Dixon line, the southern part of Missouri, would be free, and south of that would be slave states. And basically it set up a principle that every time a new free state was admitted, a new slave state would be admitted as well, and that was supposed to keep the balance of free and slave states as a compromise. Well, that compromise is wearing away because Northern abolitionists are becoming more aggressive and trying to get rid of slavery, and Southern slave states were becoming more aggressive in trying to maintain slavery. But this repealed the Missouri Compromise. It did create two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska, and it allowed those new territories to vote, have popular sovereignty. The people of the territories could vote on whether or not they wanted to have slavery or be a free state. This created a problem. If it's going to be up to a vote, it just depends on who lives in these territories. So abolitionists organized a campaign to get as many abolitionists as they could to move into these territories to sway the vote. At the same time, people in the South were trying to get as many people from the South who were pro-slavery to move into these territories to sway the vote. So they were trying to affect the vote by getting people to move in there. And then this leads to something called Bleeding Kansas, where there's actual physical violence between them. So again, disrupting the whole prior compromises, going all the way back to the founding of America, all those prior compromises about slavery, it is disrupting and coming to a head that will lead to the Civil War. Now, also prior to the Civil War, but separate issue, is the Homestead Act of 1862. This is just America expanding into the West. And as we had this new Louisiana Purchase and we wanted to expand the country westward, we needed people to move westward. And how do you get people to move westward? Well, you offer them free land. So the United States government said if you moved westward, they would give you 160 acres of land. It's not completely free. You had to pay a legal processing fee, a filing fee, but it was really low, so the land was basically free. The only condition was, besides the filing fee, is that you had to live on the land for 5 continuous years and farm it. So that got lots of people to move westward. So it's westward expansion for the United States. The Homestead Act of 1862 pushes for Americans to move and expand westward. So just think of homesteading, pretty straightforward there. The Pendleton Act of 1883, this established a merit system for getting government jobs. Before this, jobs were usually handed out by political winners, politicians. Politicians would basically give government jobs to their friends or people who supported them, people who donated to them, things like that. So there was the spoils system as it was known back then. And then when someone lost an election and a new person came in, they'd fire all the government workers and appoint their friends. Well, this was very disruptive for the operation of the government, firing all these people and replacing them with just friends who probably had no expertise or anything like that. It was also leading to government corruption. So the Pendleton Act was supposed to replace all that with a civil service where people would compete for the jobs, and once they had the jobs, they would be professionals and they would stay through different administrations, different politicians. So that's the Pendleton Act of 1883, establishing a merit-based system for getting and keeping government jobs. 2 other things that you need to know about that you might remember from U.S. history. The New Deal and the Great Society, very similar, both in the 1900s. The New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt during the Great Depression came up with a series of plans, all combined into what he called the New Deal. They were for the relief of the Great Depression, the recovery from the Great Depression, and then reforming the political and economic system so there wouldn't be another Great Depression. And it created a whole variety of programs. They might ask you about the Social Security program, just as an example, but they're probably not going to ask you about like specific things like the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, if you've ever heard of that, or Works Progress Administration, WPA. But these were jobs programs. CCC and WPA were just programs to take unemployed people and give them temporary jobs, building public infrastructure, things like that. There was banking reforms, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, to prevent bank runs in the future. So if you remember from US history, maybe you learned about the bank runs, how people would go to the bank and withdraw all their money, and then the bank would go bankrupt, and people who still had money in the bank would lose it all. Well, now, if your bank gets robbed or your bank closes or whatever, the government insures it and gives you your money back. So there's no reason to rush the bank because you're not going to lose any money. So that was the point. And then, of course, Social Security kept people from poverty in their old age. So that was the New Deal, whole series of programs in the Great Depression to fix the economy. Similarly, President Johnson in the 1960s came up with what he called the Great Society. The Great Society was basically the war on poverty, doing all sorts of different programs to fight poverty in America. Two of those programs were Medicare and Medicaid, which provide health insurance for elderly people or poor people. The Elementary and Secondary Schools Act provides federal funding to public schools if they meet certain conditions. So the government can get state schools to do what they want by dangling this money out there. And then, of course, the Housing and Urban Development Act, which was supposed to help urban areas that, because of suburbanization after World War II, were becoming dilapidated. People were fleeing the cities. So this was supposed to reinvest in those cities. So what you need to know, though, is that the New Deal and the Great Society were both programs from these presidents to help out with the economy of America and create jobs and create basic safety nets such as Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. So investments in America's economy and America's people. Another one of the major legislations they want you to know about is the Clean Air Act of 1970. This one's pretty straightforward and simple. It's in the name. It's an anti-pollution act. So it was a major piece of environmental legislation, and it required the EPA to do two things: to identify where air pollution was coming from, and then create regulations to limit that air pollution. So it's right there in the name. It's the Clean Air Act. So 1970 is early in the environmental movement, right around the founding of Earth Day and things like that. So Clean Air Act of 1970. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The Gulf of Tonkin is a body of water over by Vietnam. And there was an incident in which maybe Vietnamese attacked American Navy ships. It's now debated what really happened. There's disagreement on that. But at least at the time, it was claimed that the North Vietnamese, had attacked the US Navy. In response, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and it gave President Johnson the power to take any action he deemed necessary in all of Southeast Asia to protect American interests. And when you tell the president he can take any military action he wants, he is probably going to take military action. And that's what they did. Prior to that, U.S. troops in the Vietnam area were just advisors. They weren't supposed to be directly involved in actual fighting. But after the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, the U.S. military gets directly involved in fighting, and we send many, many more troops. So the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution leads to an escalation of the Vietnam War. So just remember the Gulf of Tonkin, Gulf, body of water, off of Vietnam, and hopefully then you'll remember, okay, it leads to the Vietnam War. I mean, technically the Vietnam War between North and South Vietnam was already going on, but it leads to us getting more heavily involved in the war. the Alien and Sedition Acts. Alien, people from outside. Sedition is like treason. It's going against your government. So the Alien and Sedition Acts are to deal with the threat of foreigners doing something bad in our country. There was a sort of quasi-war going on where France was seizing U.S. ships, so we weren't in direct war, but Congress passes these laws because they fear that war is coming. So there were 4 laws passed by the Federalist-controlled Congress and Federalist President John Adams. You don't need to know that they were Federalists or anything like that. But the whole purpose was to reduce foreign influence in the United States and to limit public criticism of the government. It actually made it illegal to criticize President Johnson, or not President Johnson, I don't know why I said Johnson, President Adams. It made it illegal to criticize what President Adams was doing. Now, generally speaking, Americans like the ability to criticize their government. So they did not like the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is there a Supreme Court to strike it down at this point?
So I'm actually going to get to that next. The Supreme Court did exist, but the Supreme Court at this point had never struck down a law. So if you remember, judicial review comes from the Marbury v. Madison case in the 1800s. So at this point, the Supreme Court had never done that and didn't in this case either.
So how did it get removed?
Well, let me go to the next slide here. The Adams administration and the Federalist Congress that passed the bill set it to expire in 2 years on the last day of John Adams' presidency. The reason they did that is because they were already fairly unpopular and they were fearing that they could lose the election. So one thing they wanted to do is make it illegal to criticize them, hoping that would save them and they would win the election. But just in case, if they lost the election, they would want to be able to criticize the next president. So they made sure that the laws expired on the last day of their term in office. So again, it made it more difficult to become a citizen because they wanted to reduce foreign influence. So if you were an immigrant, it became harder to become a citizen, so therefore harder to get voting rights. And it made it illegal to criticize the government. Obviously, that is a violation of the First Amendment, and if Congress tried to do that today, the Supreme Court would overturn it. In fact, just to make it really obvious what they were doing, most of the people thrown in jail were editors of newspapers run by the other political party. So they were literally just throwing their political opponents in jail. And again, the Supreme Court had not yet established judicial review, which they did in what case? What was the Supreme Court case that established judicial review? I said it a few minutes ago. Marbury v. Madison. That's one of your 26 Supreme Court cases. And what you need to know about Marbury v. Madison is it established judicial review, which is the Supreme Court's ability to rule a law unconstitutional and throw it out. Okay. Even though this was not thrown out by the Supreme Court, these were very controversial at the time, and people didn't like it. The public saw clearly what they were doing, and it's considered one of the major reasons that John Adams lost the next election and Thomas Jefferson became president. Now, speaking of the government not wanting you to criticize them, what is a more recent law that allows the government to spy on you?
The Patriot Act?
Yeah, the Patriot Act of 2001. It was passed very, very quickly after 9/11. The politicians in Congress who voted for it openly admitted they had no idea what the law said because it's, well over 1,000 pages, and they basically were handed it and told, if you don't vote for this, you're supporting Al-Qaeda. Okay, I guess I'll vote for it. It greatly expanded the government's power to spy on Americans. While its effectiveness at catching terrorism is very debatable, if you ask for evidence it's caught many, if any, terrorists, the government will say, trust us, it has. But we do know it's been used to catch lots of drug dealers. And some parts of it were ruled unconstitutional. For example, you don't need to know the details, but just as an example if you're interested, one part of it was permanent gag orders where the government could go to, say, your email provider, demand that they hand over all your emails, but then order them to never tell you that they handed over all your emails. So that was the permanent gag order, is that the person that they were getting the information from could never tell anybody that they handed the information to the government. But anyway, what you need to know about the Patriot Act is it was passed after 9/11, greatly expanded government's ability to spy on you. Okay, now, that's major legislation that you need to know. There's a couple executive orders that you need to know. Executive orders are just the president's saying they have some policy, and they order their executive agencies to enact some policy. So, for example, in 1942, President Roosevelt signed an executive order that required the military to imprison Japanese Americans or Americans of Japanese ancestry who were living in the western states. This was an executive order. It was done through Roosevelt's powers as commander-in-chief over the military. It is another one of those things that today the Supreme Court would overturn, but back then the Supreme Court said, yeah, it seems fine. There's actually a Supreme Court case about it. Anyone remember that?
Had a Japanese name. But
Yeah. This is one of those.
what was the first letter of the name?
K.
I don't know.
That's okay. Even if you don't remember it, just remember the one that sounds like a Japanese name. It's Korematsu. Korematsu v. United States. Korematsu protested and said it was a violation of due process because Japanese Americans weren't charged with any crime, they weren't given any trial, any hearing or whatever. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, but it's wartime, we all have to make sacrifices. Some people are drafted and sent off to Europe to fight, you're sent to jail. You know, whatever, we all make our sacrifices. But anyway, that was an executive order, President Roosevelt with that. Then in 1948, an executive order was from President Truman that banned segregation in the armed forces. So the military was desegregated in 1948, well before many of the civil rights acts of the 50s and 60s were done. As a side note, if you've ever seen the movie Hidden Figures, you know, there's all this, you know, segregation in NASA, but that didn't actually exist because NASA was part of the military and was desegregated. But the women who the movie is about, when they first started working for the government, it was a separate organization, and it was before 1948, and it was segregated. But by the time they joined NASA, their organization was folded into NASA when NASA was created in the 1950s. And it was never segregated. So the movie's, it's half true in terms of that. Like, there was a time when they worked in a segregated facility, but when they did that, it was not NASA. Their organization was folded into NASA, and NASA was never segregated. Okay. A few more details. Just some things that I have picked up over time that might be good tips to know. Okay. The pamphlet / short book, Common Sense. You might remember it was written by Thomas Paine in 1776. They could ask you who wrote Common Sense or which book Thomas Paine wrote. That's Common Sense. But a key is to know that it provided a rationale for American independence. The whole point of Common Sense was to explain to average people why they should support independence. You don't need to know the month, but just as a reference, it was published in January of 1776, which makes it months before the Declaration of Independence. So it came before the Declaration because it was trying to get people to support the idea of independence, then leading to eventually the Declaration of Independence. But the key is, know that it provided a rationale for American independence. The presidency. A couple things. You should know that the president is the commander-in-chief of the military. You might remember that from middle school civics or whatever, but definitely know that. The president is the commander-in-chief. And this is one of those things that's possibly on the test, not that I have inside information, but possibly on the test that I think is stupid. You should know that the third in line is the Speaker of the House. So if the president dies or gets impeached or resigns, the vice president becomes president. If the vice president dies or gets impeached or resigns, then the Speaker of the House becomes president. Now, that is factually true. Is it one of the most important things for people to know? Probably not, because, I mean, the odds of this ever happening, it's never happened, so it's not where I would focus my time had I designed this system. But, again, not that I have any inside information, but you should know that the Speaker of the House is the third person. Okay. Speaking of not having inside information, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter in 1802. What was the topic of that letter? That's a bizarre question, but you should know. It was about religious freedom or religious liberty. I did discuss this in one of the previous sessions, so Patrick might remember who Jefferson was writing to.
Wasn't it like a Baptist preacher asking him about his thoughts on like religious liberty?
It was a Baptist church, yeah. So the Baptist church in Danbury, Connecticut, when he was elected president, sent him a letter and basically complained about the way Connecticut treated Baptists. You might not, maybe you do know. The First Amendment originally only applied to the federal government, not to states. So many states still had official state churches. And in Connecticut, there was an official state church, and they basically allowed Baptists to exist as, you know, an act of toleration. And the Baptists wrote to him and said, you know, we don't think this really goes along with American values. We think everybody should have religious freedom, and it shouldn't be that we allow you to exist as a favor to you. And they wanted to know what Thomas Jefferson's ideas were, and he wrote back and said, basically, I agree with you. He supported religious freedom and thought that there should be no official government church, and that everybody should be free in their religious ideas. So Thomas Jefferson's 1802 letter was about religious liberty / religious freedom. Okay. What is the selective service? Anyone know? If you're an American citizen, you should be.
They call you up. You're like Catholic.
Yeah. Say, if you guys are American citizens, you hopefully registered for selective service, because otherwise you can't get federal financial aid and, you know, all sorts of stuff. But the selective service, it is when you register for the draft. You should know that it fits in with the preamble to the Constitution, specifically its statement about the common defense. So if you don't remember the preamble, it says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution the United States of America. So this part here about providing for the common defense, that is where they get the idea of the military draft and supporting a military as a government function. Side note, you should also know that we, the people, is popular sovereignty. The idea that the people have the power, not the government. The people give the government power, but the people can always take the power back, which is the Declaration of Independence. We told England that we give the government power, and when we don't like the government, we can overthrow the government. But selective service fits in with the common defense. Another thing you might want to know, the idea of no taxation without representation is found in two important documents. One is the Declaration of Independence, but also the Magna Carta. Now, if you were to Google, why is the Magna Carta important? You would have to dig pretty far before you found something about taxation without representation. But technically, part of the Magna Carta was that the nobles would get to choose 25, I think it was 25, might have been 24, but they got to choose 25 of themselves, 25 nobles, to represent them to the king. That didn't actually happen because the Magna Carta, I think 12 days later, shortly after, the Pope invalidated the Magna Carta. So it didn't quite happen, but at least the concept of the nobles being able to pick representatives was in the Magna Carta. So the idea that if the king was going to tax the nobles, they were entitled to representation is in the Magna Carta. So no taxation without representation is in the Declaration of Independence, but also in the Magna Carta. Okay. What is Roe v. Wade about? It is about abortion. Okay, now, Patrick, since he was here for my Supreme Court.
You have to call it reproductive rights.
Yes. Okay. You should know that Roe v. Wade is about reproductive rights. That's the phrase that they might use, not that I have inside information, but that's the phrase they might use. They probably will not use the word abortion. But also, it limited or reduced states' powers. And this, hypothetically, this would be a really tricky question to say something like, which of these cases reduced states' powers? Because normally when we think of Roe v. Wade, we don't think of it as a state power issue. But the key is that before Roe v. Wade, every state could restrict abortion however they wanted to. But once Roe v. Wade passed, it limited the ability of states to restrict abortion, or it took power away from states. They couldn't restrict abortion in certain ways, so therefore it reduced or limited the power of states. So you should know those two things about Roe v. Wade. It reduced or limited states' power, and you should know the phrase reproductive rights.